The Space Eaters by Frank Belknap Long. This was originally published in Weird Tales, July 1928. The cross is not a passive agent. It protects the pure of heart, and it has often appeared in the air above our sabbats, confusing and dispersing the powers of darkness. John Dee's Necronomicon. Well, there was no real John Dee Necronomicon, but, for the sake of the book. The horror came to Partridgeville in a blind fog. All that afternoon, thick vapors from the sea had swirled and eddied about the farm, and the room in which we sat swam with moisture. The fog ascended in spirals from beneath the door, and its long, moist fingers caressed my hair until it dripped. The square paned windows were coated with a thick, dew-like moisture. The air was heavy and dank and unbelievably cold. I stared gloomily at my friend. He had turned his back to the window and was writing furiously. He was a tall, slim man with a slight stoop and abnormally broad shoulders. In profile, his face was impressive. He had an extremely broad forehead, long nose, and slightly protuberant chin. A strong, sensitive face which suggested a wildly imaginative nature, held in restraint by a skeptical and truly extraordinary intellect. My friend wrote short stories. He wrote to please himself. In defiance of contemporary taste, and his tales were unusual. They would have delighted Poe. They would have delighted Hawthorne, or Ambrose Bierce, or Villers de Isle Adam. They were studies of abnormal men, abnormal beasts, abnormal plants. He wrote of remote realms of imagination and horror. And the colors, sounds, and odors which he dared to evoke were never seen, heard, or smelt on the familiar side of the moon. He projected his creations against mind-chilling backgrounds. They stalked through tall and lonely forests, over ranged mountains, and slithered down the stairs of ancient houses, and between the piles of rotting black wharves. One of his tales, The House of the Worm, had induced a young student at Midwestern University to seek refuge in an enormous red-bricked building where everyone approved of his sitting on the floor and shouting at the top of his voice, "Lo, my beloved is fairer than all the lilies among the lilies in the lily garden." Another, the defilers had brought him precisely 110 letters of indignation from local readers when it appeared in the Partridgeville Gazette, and I continued to stare at him until he suddenly stopped writing and shook his head. "I can't do it," he said. "I should have to invent a new language, and yet I can comprehend the thing emotionally, intuitively, if you will, if I could only convey it in a sentence somehow, the strange crawling of its fleshless spirit. Is it some new horror?" I asked. He shook his head. "It is not new to me. I have known and felt it for years, a horror utterly beyond anything your prosaic brain can conceive." "Thank you," I said. "All human beings are prosaic," he elaborated. "I meant no offense. It is the shadowy terrors that lurk behind and above them that are mysterious and awful. Our little brains, what can they know of vampire-like entities which may lurk in dimensions higher than our own, are beyond the universe of stars? I think sometimes they lodge in our heads, and our brains feel them, but when they stretch out tentacles to probe and explore us, we go screaming mad." He was staring at me steadily now. "But you can't honestly believe in such nonsense," I exclaimed. "Of course not," he shook his head and laughed. "You know damn well I am too profoundly skeptical to believe in anything. I have merely outlined a poet's reactions to the universe. If a man wishes to write ghostly stories and actually convey a sensation of horror, he must believe in everything and anything. By anything, I mean the horror that transcends everything, that is more terrible and impossible than everything. He must believe that there are things from outer space that can reach down and fasten themselves on us, with malevolence that can destroy us utterly, our bodies as well as our minds. But this thing from outer space, how can he describe it if he doesn't know its shape, or size, or color? It is virtually impossible to describe it. That is what I have sought to do, and failed, perhaps someday, but then, I doubt if it can ever be accomplished. But your artist can hint, suggest. Suggest what? I asked, a little puzzled. Suggest a horror that is utterly unearthly, that makes itself felt in terms that have no counterparts on earth. I was still puzzled. He smiled wearily and elaborated his theory. There is something prosaic, he said, about even the best of the classic tales of mystery and terror. Old Miss Radcliffe, with her hidden vaults and bleeding ghosts. Maturin, with his allegorical Faust-like hero villains, and his fiery flames from the mouth of hell. Edgar Poe, with his blood-clotted corpses and black cats, his telltale horrors and disintegrating Valdemars. Hawthorne, with his amusing preoccupation with the problems and horrors arising from mere human sin, as though human sins were of any significance to a coldly malign intelligence from beyond the stars. Then we have modern masters. Algernon Blackwood, who invites us to a feast of the high gods, as he calls them, and shows us an old woman with a hare-lip sitting before a Ouija board, fingering soiled cards, or an absurd nimbus of ectoplasm emanating from some clairvoyant ninny. Bram Stoker, with his vampires and werewolves, mere conventional myths, the tag ends of medieval folklore. Wells, with his pseudo-scientific bogies, fishmen at the bottom of the sea. Ladies in the Moon, and the 101 idiots who are constantly writing ghost stories for the magazines. What have they contributed to the literature of the unholy? Are we not made of flesh and blood? But it is but natural that we should be revolted and horrified when we are shown that flesh and blood in a state is shown that flesh and blood in a state of corruption and decay, with worms passing over and under it. It is but natural that a story about a corpse should thrill us, fill us with fear and horror and loathing. Any fool can awaken these emotions in us. Poe really accomplished very little with his lady ushers and liquescent Valdemars. He appealed to simple, natural, understandable emotions, and it was inevitable that his readers should respond. Are we not the descendants of barbarians? Did we not once dwell in tall and sinister forests at the mercy of beasts that rend and tear? It is but inevitable that we should shiver and cringe when we meet in literature dark shadows from our own past, harpies and vampires and werewolves. What are they but magnifications, distortions of the great birds and bats and ferocious dogs that harassed and tortured our ancestors? It is easy enough to rouse fear by such means. It is easy enough to frighten men with the flames at the mouth of hell, because they are hot and shrivel and burn the flesh. And who does not understand and dread a fire, blows that kill, fires that burn, shadows that horrify, because their substances lurk evilly in the black corridors of our inherited memories? I am weary of the writers who would terrify us by such pathetically obvious and trite unpleasantness. Real indignation blazed in his eyes. Suppose there were a greater horror. Suppose evil things from some other universe should decide to invade this one. Suppose we couldn't see them. Suppose we couldn't feel them. Suppose they were of a color unknown on Earth, or rather of an appearance that was without color. Suppose that they had a shape unknown on Earth. Suppose they were 4-dimensional, 5-dimensional, 6-dimensional. Suppose they were 100-dimensional. Suppose they had no dimensions at all and yet existed. What could we do? And the metaphysical ties to the physical in some ways, doesn't it?